All right, welcome back to the channel, everyone. I am here with Kevin Lai. Thank you for being here, Kevin. So, Kevin
Thank you for
debated
having me.
policy as part of Peninsula LL, won the Baker Award, which, for those of you who don't know, is like the number one team over the course of the entire season, and got semis of TOC to boot, plus won, a million other tournaments. So we're extremely happy to have him at the Argument Institute to coach both, PF and LD. So thank you so much for being on the channel. So I guess first we will start with some questions, just very open-ended about what your thoughts are on debate. So my question for you is, what are your like top three or so hot takes about debate, having just come out of it?
Thank you for having me on, and I'm really excited to be here. Um, so my hot takes, I think they primarily center around how I think about debate and how I think about risk analysis in debate. The fundamental thing that is core to my being is the belief that 0% risk does not exist. And so that's my first hot take, which is that there's no such thing as zero risk. Um, every argument presented has some amount of uncertainty built into it. That's just the nature of physics. Quantum physics tells us that no prediction can be 100% accurate, which means that in the same way that there can be no such thing as zero risk, you can never prove something is absolutely false when you're making predictions about future events. In the same way, nothing is 100% true. If I make a statement and it is dropped, I guess that's my second hot take, which is that even if a dropped argument is totally dropped by every single speech of your opponents, it's still not 100%. There's still some degree of built-in uncertainty, which suggests that a lot of things like try or die or other arguments of that nature kind of go away because no matter what, there is always some risk that something will happen and some risk that some things will not happen. And then my third hot take, which also flows from the logical consequence of the first, is that um, straight turns do not need to win uniqueness. And what I mean by that is usually many people will say, especially in policy, that if you're straight turning something, which means that you're flipping it on its head and you're making an argument that was originally your opponent's into yours, you have to win uniqueness. For example, if I am answering the economy disadvantage, and the economy disadvantage says that the plan or the affirmative hurts the economy. There's also an uniqueness argument that says that currently the economy is doing well now, but the AF would undermine it. Um, many people will say the straight turn, you have to win that the economy is doing poorly now in order to then win that the AF can boost the economy. But I don't think that's true because the negatives argument or the cons argument from the outset is not that the economy is perfect now and that there's a 0% probability that the economy could ever decrease in the future. Your argument is like, all right, the economy is doing pretty well now, but of course, there's always some chance that it could go down, and we're not totally sure about our predictions. And so, a straight turner says, um, even if the economy is doing pretty well now, the affirmative still makes it even better. Then that's still a straight turn because that's still offense. It still demonstrates that the F is a good idea, and it is a reason why I should vote affirmative, even absent uniqueness.
First of all, I want to say thank you for saying this. I've been trying to say all of these, all three actually, for like the entire
Really?
year. So I'm glad that we're on the same page because, yeah, I think that one of the biggest problems with debate, I mean, it's policy, it's PF, it's LD, it's everything, is this very binary type thinking of like assuming that if an argument is not responded to, it therefore is 100% probability and like you can wield it as such. And that if you do respond to an argument that like it just completely goes away and that there's like zero truth value in it, with this assumption that like lots and lots of defense can be terminal. So I'm generally like I agree with these statements, but I do go back and forth on them because I've debated this out with some people recently. So I have four questions I want to ask about all of this. Number one, is what about empirical statements about the past? So, for instance, if I say, for instance, like World War II didn't happen, that statement probably, in fact, has zero probability. Would you?
Mm-hmm. So yes, I should have added a qualifier that most of this stuff applies to debates about predicting future consequences and specifically trying to decide what the consequences or the effects of a policy proposal would be. So for things about empirical facts of the past, for the most part, I think they can be binary. Um, and this also applies to many theoretical arguments. Like if you're debating about a shell, sometimes it has to be binary. Did you violate or did you not violate? It's not a probabilistic claim. All right, there's a 50% chance you violated the shell, which doesn't make any sense. So um, I think it depends on whether, yeah, we're talking about the future and stuff of that nature, or some theoretical issues that aren't necessarily probabilistic.
Yeah, that's interesting too, because I actually think that there's a case to be made that empirical statements can also be probabilistic if we divide the probability into like probability in fact and credence, as in like the probability, like if I were to bet on this, whether or not this happened, what probability should I assign it? And so it might be the case that, like, for instance, the violation of a shell, right? Like, or the guilt. We can compare this to like guilt in a trial. Like the jury might actually think there's like an 80% chance this person is guilty based on all of the evidence produced, and then therefore make the decision as if they were guilty in a binary fashion. And we know that like
Mm.
in fact they either were or were not. But that fact might not be like epistemically something that we can access. And so maybe debate also functions like that and like credence values of like expected probability that this is in fact a binary truth.
That makes a lot of sense to me, and that is really interesting to think about because you're right that often even these debates about theory shells, yeah, they are. It still is a probabilistic statement to some extent, and there are epistemic gaps that we don't fully know. So the judge does at some point have to arbitrarily say, all right, this is the cutoff point at which I do think that a shell is violated or not. And many times it is in terms of reasonability. If the judge thinks, all right, I don't feel like the thing they did was like that egregious, and you could construe maybe a world in which that was not their motive or their intent. A lot of those things come into play too. So that is interesting to think about. I don't have a formal um, thesis about how that side of things should operate.
Sure, yeah. It is definitely interesting to think about. I haven't seen anyone like use this in a round as like an observation, but I think it maybe would change things in some cases. Okay, the second thing that I have to say about all of these takes is I've been persuaded recently, I could go back the other way if you persuade me the other way, but I've been persuaded recently that even though technically nothing can have 0% or 100% probability, that like functionally in some cases they can. So like even though no defense is truly terminal, there's functionally terminal defense in that it like lowers the probability that I would assign to the argument to like 0.0001%. And then for our purposes in the debate, like that's basically good enough to say that it is terminal. So do you think that like terminal defense is still a useful heuristic, even if it is not in fact accurate?
Mm, I guess so. Um, for example, if an argument is dropped, like an impact, I think it's very, very large. And there is a 99.999% chance that it will happen. Um, I just specifically want to apply these observations to arguments of the nature of triad, which is
Right.
when a team will say, all right, since this impact was dropped, it certainly causes extinction. Um, and often teams will apply this against teams who do have really good defense. The other team wins really good defense that there's a very low likelihood that the affirmative could solve this existential threat. For example, if the affirm is a climate impact and then the neg says, all right, there's 1,000 reasons why you cannot solve climate change. Often the final after rebuttal will stand up and say, that's okay. Even if there's a 0.0001% chance we solve climate change, for certain since the impact was dropped that climate change is inevitable right now. So even if there's only a tiny risk we can solve it, you should vote affirmative. I think that logic is flawed because,
Yeah.
um, yeah, we can't know for certainty that climate change is going to be existential. And if that were the case, then that means that we should basically allow every bad thing to happen to have any small chance of solving climate change, which I think is flawed logic.
That makes sense. That's an interesting case too, because I think in that case, ironically, they're admitting against this binary th thinking by saying that your terminal, like nothing is terminal, right? Like our argument cannot have 0% probability. But then they're applying the binary thinking and the uniqueness side. And so there's this weird disconnect where they're like, we don't think the link is binary, but we do think the uniqueness is binary. And in truth, if neither of them is binary, then the try or die falls apart. But yeah, that's another case where like observing that it's not actually binary actually helps like extinction calculus, right? In that case, there is a functional difference between 0.0001 and like 0% probability in either this like hypothetical try or die case where we don't believe in, or the case we probably do believe in, which is like the, you know, if we're multiplying this by trillions of possible expected lives, then it actually is relevant if the defense is actually terminal or functionally terminal. Because
Mm.
then it like doesn't actually isn't sufficient to moot our offense. I guess the other case that applies is like presumption, which assumes that like you actually have zero offense, not like 0.00001 offense. And I think people play with that a little bit too loosely. I think that if people recognize this, then there would be like almost zero presumption ballots. Um,
Yeah, so I guess that's the reason why functionally terminal defense is still different from terminal defense because I don't think I would basically never vote on presumption. And um, that also means that even if there's a very small likelihood they solve some big existential risk, that still matters. I just think that in most edge cases, this doesn't matter because the point of debate is not to try to win defense, it's to be offensive. And so as long as you're going hard for offense and winning some external impact, you should be fine.
yeah, for sure. Okay, the third thing I have to say,
Oh,
yeah.
sorry. One more thing I really want to say very fast was I think the proponents of the binary thinking would say that the difference between the uniqueness and the link stuff is in the context of the uniqueness stuff, they will say it was dropped. Like they have asserted that climate change is existential. You have not responded to that claim. While in terms of the solvency stuff, they will say, all right, they have some arguments for why they could potentially solve, even if it's very marginal. So they would argue that's the difference for why one is binary and the other is not. But yeah, I still think that logic is flawed and there kind of is a contradictory position there.
That's actually exactly what I want to talk about next, because I think that maybe one of the disconnects is like, yeah, they would say this is like strat skew, right? Like the conclusion is conceded. Therefore, if you say that we didn't get the conclusion later on and the conclusion was binary, then that's like too late in the debate and it would be judge intervention to like vote on that. I think that maybe there's a concept that we can introduce about like logical validity, like the logical structure of the argument, where like obviously every argument has to flow logically from the premises being true. Like the construction of the argument has to be accurate. So there's two ways for us to conclude that the argument does not have an absolute probability, even if you say it does. One is that all of the premises necessarily are claims that cannot have a 100% probability. So like logically, the conclusion, even if it does flow from the premises being true, cannot then have a 100% probability because the premises can't have a 100% probability. But then they would say, okay, you should have said that right earlier. So then the second way we can resolve this is maybe like um, the conclusion does not in fact flow from the premises being true, or something of that nature. Like you cannot conclude that something is certain from the warrants or evidence that has been given in the round. And then we have to talk about kind of like a paradigm question of like, why is it okay for judges to say you did not prove this, even though you said that you proved it, when like the other team did not assert that you did not prove that early enough in the round?
These are very hard questions to think through. And that's why I do believe that at the end of the day, a lot of debate is still about judge intervention, and there always has to be involvement at the judge at some level. So for the first idea about whether or not the claims themselves are probabilistic, I don't think that it's the burden of the opponent to point out the fact that many of these claims are not binary. And the reason why is because I feel like in either case, it's kind of the judge's predisposition. So in most cases, judges have a very Newtonian view of way of looking at the world, where they're like a physicist who thinks that we can show with 100% certainty that if you hit a ball in this way, it would land right there. but I think that is a predisposition, that's a bias that's being made. The judge can also come from the perspective of a quantum physicist who would argue that the as you become more and more specific in identifying the location of the ball, for example, then the momentum predictions would become far more inaccurate. And I'm not a physicist, but I know many who can explain that idea better. But basically, the predisposition can be just that all claims have some degree of uncertainty, and so it's not a burden on the opponents to point that out. Um, so the second thing I would say for that claim about the claims is that many times there is built-in uncertainty even from the outset. When the negative team says, when they're reading elections decide, for example, about Trump versus Harris in the 2024 election, their uniqueness argument is never, all right, there's 100% certainty that no matter what happens, Trump is going to win the election out. It's always like Trump is going, well, it's like Harris is going to win out. But it's like a 60-40. The polls say that it's almost a toss up. It's kind of close. And so it's possible for the affirmative to flip that. So I think that they're basically like, it's not the burden of the opponents pointed out. And then for a second idea about uh, arguments not flowing logically from the previous claims, that is really hard. And I'm not sure at what point the judge should intervene. I can think of debates where I've double turned myself without realizing that I double turned myself. The opponents never pointed out. But then the judges vote against me because I've double turned myself. And the logical consequence of that, even though I argued it was a reason why I should win the debate, it was actually a reason why I should lose the debate. I think that's a rational decision to make because decisions, they they are roadmaps. They have to logically make sense. It's not just a series of yes no questions, or it's not just like I think that they still have to logically prove something true. So it could make sense for why a judge could intervene. um, I guess another example is like, well, yeah, I'm just like not totally sure. I feel like either way the judge decides that debate, I could see it making some sense to me.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I recently have had some conversations about judge intervention and kind of exactly those examples. Maybe I have like an idea to pass by you to see if this might resolve some of these questions. The idea is like maybe judge intervention is defined by the judge inserting their opinion into the round in a way that's kind of unpredictable, or especially in a way that is against an assumption that was agreed upon by both teams. Now, the
Mm,
problem is the judge doesn't know this, right? Like the judge doesn't know what both teams agree upon, except for the evidence that is the round, or maybe even things outside of the round as well, like the norms, the context in which the round occurs. But I think that
mm,
my model of judge intervention is like something is bad, as in I would call it interventionist. Like we're kind of using intervention in different ways, but like something is bad intervention. It is wrong for a judge to vote in a way that goes against something that all of the that they could predictably have foreseen all of the debaters agree with, if that
mm,
makes sense. And so the thing is, the converse of that is when it is evident that the debaters disagree over something and that thing hasn't been justified in either direction, I think it is the judge has to decide that themselves, sort of logically, like there's no other way. And so in that case, something that is often called intervention is actually proper intervention. That's like that is required. So,
mm,
for instance, there's actually a weird difference here where like if in your round, the other team had, if the judge can predictably assume that both teams agree that if something is a double turn, even without pointing it out, the judge should like go against that. Then it is interventionist for them to not have done that. But conversely, if the judge could have predicted that both teams actually agree that that would be bad, then it would be interventionist for them to do that. Like, I don't know if that makes sense. Like, I think it kind of depends on what the norms of the round are.
So my response to your view of judge intervention is I think I don't totally agree. And the reason why is because in my mind, debate is still more an activity about the debaters adapting to the judge rather than the judge adapting to the debaters. I don't think that it's necessarily the burden of the judge to figure out what the debaters come to expect and the kinds of things that they have reached a consensus on that they think are not up for debate and the things that they think are up for debate. I mean, there are outlandish examples I can think of. For example, if both teams think that it's okay to say the N-word, I don't know if a judge should also assume that as well, just because both teams have reached that consensus. So I think that as for me, what judge intervention should be about is it's bad when a judge deviates from the norms and the beliefs that they state themselves to have. For
Mhm.
instance, if you say that you're a truth over tech judge, then that should be the way you judge a debate. And it's fine if you judge a debate that way because you've said that on your paradigm. You can apply that non-arbitrarily. You can lay out what specific truths you hold yourself to. And if that's the case, like I have nothing against parent judges, for example. Um, as long as if it's not arbitrary, if they're predictable on how they evaluate a debate, then I think that's fine.
That makes sense. That's interesting. Maybe there's a way to find a middle ground between both of our approaches, where like it's your approach first, and then the rest of it that is unpredictable is dictated by my approach. So, for instance,
Mm,
the judge's intervention is first dictated by if they're following their paradigm, and what is reasonably entailed by their paradigm, I guess, or anything else they said to the teams before the round. And then anything else is sort of based on what is predictable. I guess this sort of all comes back to the central conclusion of how to make the judge's decision predictable and to avoid these weird rounds where the judge, like because they come from a totally different circuit or a totally different background, which happens more in PF admittedly than in policy, they like vote in a way that the teams totally could not have expected, or could not have controlled at all.
that's true. I think a middle ground might be preferable. At least from my personal experience, the judges I like the most are not the most technical judges, and they're also not, of course, the most truthy judges, but somewhere closer to the middle. Um, so yeah, I think the core problem is around making decisions more predictable. Um, because it's the unpredictable decisions that hurt the most, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, the last thing that you said in these hot takes is that you don't think that a link turn needs to win uniqueness. I'm inclined to agree. I think the word need is doing a lot there, though. So one opinion that I have is that like uniqueness still does help a lot. Um, and the example is like, for instance, if the links are kind of equal, because we do both agree that these things are probabilistic, right? Like, let's pretend that there's like a 50% chance that this thing goes up and a 50% chance that it goes down. I think that uniqueness actually becomes a magnitude filter. For instance, if we're talking about like countering piracy, if I prove that there is one pirate right now, then you can only solve one pirate. But like you could presumably create like 10 pirates. And so the even if there's like a equal magnitude of the link and equal risk of the link, like if your link happens, both of the links do the same amount in either direction, and they have equal probability of happening. Then in that case, I think it still makes sense because of the uniqueness to vote against this proposal to counter piracy that might have a 50% chance of backfiring.
Yeah, certainly. None of these things were to say that like uniqueness doesn't matter, for example. It's just that it's not a necessary requirement to win a straight turn. Um, and that mathematically makes a lot of sense. Another example, elections decide uh, Trump, if Harris had 70% chance of winning the election, and it was a 50-50, the link versus link turn, then obviously I would vote for the negative because um, there's a 70% chance that Harris wins now. So at best, the plan could only increase that by 30%. And so it would just be like 70% times 50% is more than 30% times 50%. So then I'd vote negative.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's interesting because like this doesn't hold in cases where you can't theoretically hit the limit. Like for instance,
Mm.
if both teams are only linking into this would never happen, but if they're only linking into a like a 10% difference in election outcome, like either the potential for Harris to win goes up by 10% or down by 10%, and that's it. It stops there. Then whoever wins, like there's a 51% chance it goes up and a 49% chance it goes down, then that would be the only thing that you should be concerned about. Unless
Yeah,
it's
that's
above 90% right now or below 10% right now.
mhm. I agree with that. Um, yeah.
Cool. I'm glad we're on the same page. Yeah, these are
Yeah,
interesting things to talk about because, like, low key, I really think a lot of people just aren't thinking about debate in this way, and so it's refreshing to have someone else who has this kind of view of risk analysis.
it is really refreshing, and not many people do think this way. Um, but yeah, I think it's interesting.
Yeah. Okay, the next question I want to ask of you is some advice that you might give like your past self coming into debate. Like what do you think is the most helpful advice you can give to some of the people who are watching my channel who are doing policy debate?
For policy debaters and for myself, I think one piece of advice I'd give is um, the best debaters, in my opinion, they're not the best researchers, they're not the fastest, they're not the most eloquent, even. I think the best debaters are just the best strategists. And the reason why I say that is because I feel like debate is just a board game. I think Scopa said debate is a chess game. And ultimately, I agree with that view. I think the reason why Devin and I were pretty successful at policy debate, like we were not good at spreading, we were not fast. I don't think we sounded the best either. We kind of have hiccups and stuff like that during our speeches sometimes. But I think the thing we did really good at was we often saw the full picture and we didn't just go through the motions. It wasn't like, all right, this was how I was taught to extend a disadvantage, so that's how I would do it. This was the counter plan I was going to go for at the start of the debate, so I'm just going to go through on that. Instead, we really saw how all of the pieces fit together and how arguments interact with each other. No page was isolated to itself. Everything was interconnected. Everything could be applied to something else. And so I just think Devin and I, we were good at um, piecing that together, finding out the best final rebuttal. And that's the skill that I think is one of the most important skills to work on. And so, what that means more tangibly for debaters who are trying to improve is, especially for novices and for JV debaters or debaters who are still trying to improve, the most important thing is not to spend a bunch of time cutting cards or doing research. I think it's far more important to give redos and to give speeches and to try to simulate debates where you have to make moves, you have to make decisions as to which impact you're going to extend, what argument is going to make it into the final rebuttal, how you're going to utilize different pieces of offense to straight turn or double turn or cross apply to something else. And I think that's a very big skill that I think is missing from a lot of debaters' toolkit.
Dude, you're speaking my language. I completely agree with all of this stuff, and would definitely echo it. You know, like think more, prepare less is definitely the mantra that will get you the most success in the long term. And I think especially one thing that resonated with me from what you just said is like no page is disconnected. No page exists in isolation. There's always a way to cross apply and like interact arguments between pages. So that's what really is actually going on under the surface. Like all of these things are heuristics for what is actually being represented by them. I think that a lot of the times, especially in like technical debate and like high level policy debate, the heuristics get treated as if they are the arguments rather than representations of the arguments. And so the stuff underneath sort of gets lost. And I think that's a shame.
All of this is making me really happy because I am really happy that it feels like, yeah, we kind of are on the same page. And I really like what you have to say as well.
Let's go. Okay. So one more advice question. The majority of my viewers are PFers because I'm a PF coach. I know
Mhm.
that you might not be the most familiar with PF, but I was wondering, uh, if like what things from policy do you think best can be learned in PF? Given the current state of PF, where like it seems like PFers are really trying to copy policy. What things do you think like they should not copy? What things do you think they should copy, or what lessons in general should be learned?
Hmm. Mm. So yeah, I'm not sure what the final rebuttals look like in PF, but I think one thing policy does really good at is in the final rebuttals, um, most policy teams, you're collapsing to one or two arguments and you're condensing to just those few arguments. I think that's really important to take away. Policy debate is really good at making debates really broad at the beginning. So it's really hard for your opponents to respond to all of them, but then making it really narrow at the end and really deep instead. Maybe PF is really, really good at that, but I think that's just really useful and strategic because Um, you don't have to win every single reason why something is bad or good. You only have to win one. And the most important thing is to win that one thing really well, and then to do a lot of weighing, to do a lot of impact calculus to prove why it's the most important thing and why it's more important than your opponents. And I think that's served me really well. And I think that's served the policy debate community very well. And if PF isn't doing that already, that's something I would encourage PF to do more of.
That makes sense. This is something that I think most PFers are doing already. It's almost
Okay.
like forced in PF a little bit because our final speech is actually 2 minutes. So it's kind of hard to go for anything more than one argument in 2 minutes. But I actually have a question about this because while I agree with you that this is the most strategic thing and it makes a lot of sense, I've been struggling recently with the conclusion from like risk calculus, that like why does it make sense to only use one argument when two arguments could be added together? Like if we have a model of risk calculus where we say everything is probability times magnitude, assuming that we're doing utilitarianism, then could it not be the case that like uh, if you extend and go for two arguments and then you like add together the percent chance that they happen times like whatever magnitude presumably of extinction it is, that might be bigger than one even if neither one is bigger than that on its own.
From a math perspective, I think you're 100% right. Two is more than one. Um, the issue, I think, is that judges are not mathematicians. And in fact, judges were very irrational. We're human, we're fallible. And I think we do suffer from many, many cognitive biases. One of the primary ones is the conjunctive fallacy, where an impact seems scarier the more you explain it, the more you're able to paint a narrative around it and outline exactly how US-China's war is going to happen. It's going to happen in this SCS island because of this warship hitting this other warship, and that's going to cause China to become more aggressive, and then somehow a nuclear weapon will be launched. That narrating actually reduces the mathematical likelihood of a scenario because now you've added more internal link steps that are required for you to win that scenario. A broad China war scenario that's very vague and is unexplained is mathematically more likely than a specific one about the SCS. And yet the SCS one seems way scarier and way more realistic because judges don't like voting for vague arguments. And so I think the fact that we do condense down to one argument is fundamentally about um, addressing a cognitive bias that judges have rather than a necessarily logical mathematical principle that undergirds it.
That's really interesting. Do you think that vagueness could be like, do you think it is possible to go against this cognitive bias by pointing this out? For instance, if I made an argument with framing about vagueness having a higher mathematical probability, and then making an argument that says like all of your point predictions of specific scenarios, inherently have a very low probability, but my argument is more structural about how like miscommunication in general is more likely to happen, which will produce all sorts of different events. And I can like give you the examples step by step if you want, but they're examples rather than arguments. And so they have a, greater probability when added together.
That can definitely be effective. And I really like that way of framing it. So there are a couple examples in which I can see that being successful. One are critiques about security or complexity or the traditional ways of international relations. I've seen many of them applied in ways that suggest that specific incidents of conflict are vastly unlikely, why we should prefer structural approaches. Second are things like the capitalism critique, where one big way of framing it is like it's the structural nature of capitalism that drives all of these crises, all of the AFS impacts, and it kind of undergirds and turns and is the root cause of everything else. A third example, I just remember watching this debate. It was the NET of 2022 or 2021. Anyways, yeah, it was a Dartmouth versus Emory debate, and I think Dartmouth did a very effective job at pointing out some of the flaws with the idea of specificity, the cult of specificity. Emory made an argument that, all right, our impact is not just about nuclear terrorism broadly, it's about Boko Haram nuclear terrorism, which Dartmouth has no evidence about. So because we have such specific evidence about such a specific group, that means that it's a unique scenario for nuclear escalation that they have no game on. And then Dartmouth was just like, all right, the fact that it's more specific does not make it more likely, but it makes it less likely. The fact that it's Boko Haram means that it's like a fraction of like they worded it far better than I did, and it was a lot more ethosy and pathosy. But I think that was an example of applying that idea well.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I feel like that's an area for people to strategically exploit more than they currently do.
Definitely, yeah.
So, last questions I want to ask you is about your thoughts on our very likely PF topic for September and October, which is resolved the European Union should establish a nuclear sharing agreement with France to create an independent deterrent capability. I hope I got that right. That was off the dome. So, I have like first question is just what are your thoughts on this? And then I want to go through and see if you can answer a bunch of questions back to back with like 1 minute answers.
First thing I'll say, I don't know too much about this topic. I haven't done any research. And so I'm sure many of you know more about this than I do. The second thing is, I think it's really interesting and it does seem to be a very pertinent issue right now. At least from my preliminary understanding, it seems like there are arguments for both sides. And so I think it'll be a fun debate topic to have.
Definitely. Do you like how, I guess overall, how would you approach the topic if you were prepping it? Are there any like advantages or DAs that immediately come to mind for what your strategy might be, or what would you expect the other side to start reading?
For the side that favors the French deterrent, I think that the three primary arguments would be about deterring Russia, um, establishing autonomy within the European Union to separate away from the United States and from traditional NATO structures. Um, and then there can be impacts about European leadership and about EU diplomacy and arguments of that nature. And then the third area would be um, impacts or advantages as to why NATO is bad or why it's a paper tiger, or why we should try to shift away from that. As for the other side, the con side of things, I think the three primary arguments are one, proliferation. If France all of a sudden started sharing all of their nukes with all of these European countries, that could raise the risk of either France starting more arms building or maybe Russia following suit, or maybe some other European countries also feeling like they could establish their own deterrent for a bunch of different reasons, and that could create some kind of cascading loose nukes effect. Second is US EU relations. I think Trump would be, I don't know actually, I haven't looked into this, but maybe the United States would be upset by an attempt of France to take over its role, the US's role as the guarantor of nuclear security. And that could have devastating impacts as well. And then the third is deterrence or just case turns about why actually a Euro deterrent would be bad for deterrence because France only has like a couple hundred nukes while Russia has thousands. And so it could cause Russia to become more escalatory rather than less.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think I share a lot of those intuitions. So now I have a few questions that we can speed run through. First, what would your side preference be on this topic? Which one do you think is stronger?
Hmm, that's interesting. Um, I think that I think the affirmative side is probably a little stronger.
Really? That's interesting because that's against my intuition and like against my intuition before I started researching the topic as well. Why do you think that?
Oh, initially I was going to say con, but then I thought about the current situation with Trump and all of the things he's doing to global alliances, and I think there is a powerful uniqueness question to be leveraged, which is that I don't know if this is the best way to go about establishing European independence, but given the fact that Trump is destroying the liberal international order and there seems to be the structural disease that is taking hold of the US-led order, the affirmative can have a very powerful uniqueness question argument that applies to many of the negative con positions and disadvantages that would be run. So I think that could make impact uniqueness very strong as well. So that's one reason why I slightly prefer the pro side.
That makes sense. That's intuitive. What do you think the best argument is on the topic? You had sort of six, so which one do you think is your favorite?
Hmm. Um, I feel like I guess my favorite is the Russia deterrence stuff on both sides. And the reason why is just because those can create the biggest, scariest impacts since Russia is a really big, scary actor. And if you're able to win, that there's some risk they might launch an attack against the Baltics, like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, or some other country very soon because Trump is being not very defensive of Ukraine. Although recently he has kind of flipped on that. Both sides could win a really fast impact about that. I feel like the tractability and ability to solve that is a lot lower, and with a nuclear sharing agreement. But that's like those are always the impacts I like the most because war impacts are always the most fun and they're the most immediate and they're the biggest and scariest. Um, that's how Devin and I won most of our debates. Our senior year was always just to win. Like it's just preying on the judges' cognitive biases and trying to win the fastest, scariest impact. But I think the best arguments will be around just the debate about like European Union autonomy and relationship with the United States and both sides of that. I think that's the most true area in which this question matters.
That makes sense. I have a question about this. I agree with this, but one thing that happens in especially technical PF nowadays is that lots of people they still read the stock scenarios about, for instance, Russia deterrence, but they very quickly start to run to the fringes of the topic. And the reason that they find this strategic is because all of these judges are sort of tabula rasa, or they, presumably they profess to be tabula rasa. And so if you just append a big scary impact like war scenarios to these other fringe link chains as well, even if they're more complicated, that actually might be an advantage for you because it means it's difficult for the other team to win some sort of especially terminal or functionally terminal defensive claim against them. And so my question for you is, how do you think that you can sort of like structurally hedge against these fringe arguments or weigh against them strategically in the round?
That's tough because I will say that most of the app debates I had my senior year of high school, I was going for those fringe impacts and I was tying crazy scenarios to a domestic affirmative about creating a federal jobs guarantee. Like there were many debates where I went for creating a federal jobs guarantee in the United States where we basically just give all Americans jobs will somehow stop the Israel-Gaza war from escalating to nuclear conflict, which is insane, but somehow that won us many debates. Um, so I think the approach to answering these arguments are a couple fold. First, you just have to answer all of them. Like in front of these technical judges, there kind of is no other way. But it's not that difficult. You can point out many logical holes in these kinds of arguments where there are super long internal link chains and they just facially do not make any sense. So just think about if this argument was presented in a kitchen table conversation, if you were talking to your mom about the federal jobs guarantee and Israel-Gaza war, what would be the reason why this logically makes no sense? You can analytically make those arguments. If you point them out, many judges will just be immediately persuaded by you. So that's the first step. The second thing is I think the conversation we were previously having about how specificity doesn't make something more likely, that's the kind of frame you should apply to this. There will be many impacts about random wars that Russia might start as a result of a lack of deterrence. I remember on a NATO topic, there were many impacts about the Mediterranean, Turkey, the Black Sea, the Baltics, and a bunch of other places that the Latin America that Russia would invade. But to answer all of these impacts, you don't need one specific card for each region. All you need is one piece of evidence that says Russia is screwed right now. There's no chance they could ever start a second front war when they're engaged in this bloody, drawn out battle with Ukraine. And that's just not going to happen anytime soon. That's the only card you need to take out all of these war impacts. So I think that's the second way to approach it, which is not to attack the terminal impact head on, but to attack the internal link chain where they get to the terminal impact and to try to apply broader pieces of evidence to these kinds of arguments.
That makes sense. The next question might be a little bit difficult to answer. It's one that I've been like thinking of a lot recently. But what do you think are some of those potential fringe arguments that might be read on the topic on either side?
Hmm.
And this one you can have some fun with. Like if you think of like this could also be terrible arguments that you just, think might exist out there or be read.
Interesting. Yeah, I haven't thought about this at all. Some random things I can think of right now. Maybe there could be some civilian aspect to it, like the nuclear sharing thing would also apply to nuclear reactors or something like that. that could create nuclear energy, which can access a bunch of those impacts like climate and stuff of that nature, but also neg arguments too. Um, there could also be arguments about specific countries that would be accessing these nuclear weapons. Um, for example, maybe politics-based disadvantages about or advantages about how this nuclear sharing agreement would impact specific leaders like Macron or others in specific countries, how it could either help their re-election chances or hurt them, how it could help them implement some new policy or undermine it. And if you are able to cut a even half decent shell or scenario about this, it could be really hard to respond to because no one is going to know anything about European politics, especially if it's one random country in the European Union. Um, there could also be arguments about trade-off. So setting up a nuclear sharing agreement, I'm sure it would take a lot of time and energy. Maybe it would divert focus from the military to focus on conventional things, which could, and you can argue why a conventional focus is more important. For example, there could also be arguments as to a specific, like again, specificity helps a lot here. If you're able to find, maybe it's like the specific France military department that is in charge of this. Maybe they have a issue they're focusing on. They're trying to update their like fourth generation warfare, or they're trying to build drones or something like that. Maybe this will undermine their ability to focus on that kind of modernization, and there can be an impact associated with that. Um, I think for the con side of things, there are arguments about terrorism that could apply. Uh, and the potential for nukes to be stolen and stuff of that nature. Um, but yeah, I would have to think a little more to come up with other stuff.
That
But
makes
that's all
sense.
I can think of for.
Yeah, you said earlier that maybe specificity sort of ironically might actually hurt you in some instances by lowering the probability, assuming that the other side points out how risk calculus ought actually work. How do you balance this with like the necessity it seems for specificity in some of these cases as well?
For now, I think it's not the most important thing to balance because I do believe that most judges are of the belief that specificity is good, even if they don't consciously think that, they implicitly and unconsciously do feel that. But I have tried to improve my um, research and my affirmative construction by both having specific scenarios as well as having structural claims. My senior year, the federal jobs guarantee affirmative, we had those spiky impacts that were about random war conflicts, but then our more broad thesis was just about socialism and how a federal jobs guarantee is necessary to transition to socialism. So a big part of our affirmative was also just about the structural facets of capitalism. And we applied that to every single argument under the sun. Um, oh, I can talk so much about that, but like the TLDR is just like in addition to having specific scenarios, you should also have a structural claim. The thing I was talking about, the Trump thing, like how the world is operating now, and apply that to every single argument your opponents have. On the federal jobs guarantee topic, we applied this like socialism argument to every single disadvantage that was read. We applied it to hegemony and war and military-based arguments by um, flipping them on their head and arguing why socialism would actually improve the military, for example. We applied them to economy-based disadvantages by arguing how like the economy was either bad or how socialism could improve the economy. And so every single argument you can think of, we used our thesis level claim to push back against. And so I think that's how you would balance the specificity side of things and the genericity side of things.
That makes sense. And one way to do this in maybe a more soft way for PF as well is like make the specifics just examples. You know, like currently the state of the art in PF is to make the specific argument into the entire argument. Like, you know, contention one is Azerbaijan or something. But it seems like it's much more strategic actually to say like contention one is some broader thesis about what the link might look like. And then Azerbaijan is one example that you can still leverage as its own scenario later. But you can also, it makes it easier to kick, right? Like if they do happen to have like goated Azerbaijan defense, then you're just like, well, fine, that was one example. You haven't, that doesn't like disprove the broader claim that we're making. So that might insulate you from the harms of the specificity while still enabling you to achieve the benefits of it.
I like that a lot. I think that's the right approach. Yeah.
Cool. A final question for you. What do you think are like the best paths for future research? Like what questions would you start to Google if you're prepping this topic?
Hmm. I mean, at least for me, there's just like so much I still have to figure out first. And that's just where I would start. Just like, what would a nuclear sharing agreement look like? Who would it be between? How many nukes would go to each country? What nukes would they be? What types of weapons would they be? Um, and then just like hashing all of those details out first, because I think there's a lot of fruitful evidence and arguments for both sides to be found. And just the devil is in the details after all. And then after that, I feel like getting into the nitty gritty about European politics and how Europe is interacting with countries like Russia and the United States and other allies abroad. That's just, there's so much there as well. I feel like it's all very complicated and European politics must be really interesting. I'm in Switzerland right now, and yeah, Europe is amazing. But um, I think that's where I would start. I'm not sure where I would go from there. It really is, I think research really has to be an organic process rather than trying to force something. It's all about seeing what the literature actually says and crafting the best argument out of what the literature actually says rather than forcing your vision onto it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I completely agree with that. Well, stay tuned for the Swiss Politics DA from the Argument Institute. UK season opener round one. But yeah, thanks so much for meeting with me, Kevin. I think that we've clearly had a lot of common ground, a lot of these thoughts. I think that you've even changed my perspective in some interesting ways. So thanks for giving me a lot to think about. Any final words for the audience?
Final words, you all should join Argument Institute. And yeah, it's a great program. We'll be cutting lots of cards for y'all. And thank you for having me.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for being here.